October 11th, 1991. Bolney, England. The torso of a male homicide victim which has been rolled up in some carpet is discovered in a wooded area. Since his head and both of his hands have been removed, the victim cannot be identified, so he is buried under the name unknown male. Investigators explore a number of different leads, including a wanted German fraudster who was living in the area at the time, and the possibility that the crime was a gangland killing, but the Bolney Torso is never identified. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Werder, and this week, we're traveling back to the United Kingdom to explore a very unusual story about an unidentified decedent. The 2001 murder of an individual known only as the Bolney Torso. This case was suggested to me a few years ago by a listener named Alice, and while I've covered many other stories on this podcast involving John and Jane Does, this one stands out from the rest because the victim's head and both of his hands were removed in a deliberate attempt to prevent identification. The John Doe was discovered in a wooded area near the village of Bolney, and while his exact cause of death could not be determined, he was clearly the victim of a homicide, and you got the sense that this was not the first time his killer had done something like this before. During the early stages of the investigation, one of the most promising leads involved a German businessman named Günther Kneiper, who was wanted for having orchestrated an elaborate fraud operation in Ireland. Kneiper and his girlfriend had rented out a house in Bolney during this time period and were planning to use it to continue their operation, but they abruptly left the area right before the torso was discovered. While this may have seemed like just too much of a coincidence, Kneiper was eventually tracked down and arrested, but no evidence could be found to link him to the murder. In the months leading up to this episode's release, the investigation has taken a different turn as new information has emerged to suggest that this case might be connected to the murders of a London couple named Terry Gooderham and Maxine Arnold, who were killed shortly before Christmas in 1989. That crime is also still unsolved, but it's always been suspected that the couple were the victims of a gangland killing, and there now seems to be a possibility that the same perpetrators may have been responsible for the death of the Bolney victim. Regardless of whether or not these crimes are connected, I'm going to discuss them both on today's episode, as this is a multi-layered story containing a number of different mysteries. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has over 80 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives which are not available on our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the bizarre story of the Bolney Torso. Our story begins in 1991 in Bolney, England, a village located in the mid-Sussex district of West Sussex, about 36 miles south of London, which has a population of around 1,200 people. During the early evening hours of October the 11th, a man named Colin Oliver had been visiting a friend in the nearby village of Cuckfield and was passing through Bolney in order to return to his home in Burgess Hill. Oliver was walking down an overgrown bridle path called Broxmead Lane, but decided to go through a gate into a wooded area in order to relieve himself. He soon stumbled across a rolled-up piece of carpet in some undergrowth, but upon closer inspection, Oliver noticed that it appeared to be concealing a human body. This prompted Oliver to walk to the nearest police station in the town of Haywards Heath in order to inform the Sussex police about his discovery. Oliver would later say that he was left so disturbed by what he found that he had trouble sleeping for the next few months. Police soon arrived in the woods, and when they took a closer look at the body, they noticed that the victim was missing his head and one of his hands. Since it was dark and raining heavily by this point, police were unable to remove the victim from the scene until morning, and it was only then that they noticed that both of his hands were actually gone, and a search of the area failed to turn up any of his missing extremities. Even though his head could not be found, investigators were able to determine that the victim was a white male with a large pot belly and graying chest hair, and he was also circumcised and had a small star-shaped mole on his right thigh. The initial estimates were that he was between the ages of 45 and 60 and around 5'9" or 5'10". Since the victim could not be identified, he would become known as the Bolney Torso. On the basis of some blue bottle eggs which had been left on the torso by insects, it was estimated that the victim had been dumped in the woods about a day or two before he was discovered, though the victim could have been dead for up to 7 days. According to a pathologist who examined the torso, the head was likely removed with a knife, while the hands were removed by an axe or a bolt cropper. The victim's right arm was severed 6 inches below the elbow, but severed only 2 inches below the elbow on his left arm, which led to speculation that he may have sported a tattoo on his right forearm which needed to be removed in order to prevent identification. It's been reported that the victim had a blood type which was only shared by 4% of the population, and his system contained 74 milligrams of alcohol, indicating that he likely drank around 2 pints of beer approximately 10 hours before he died, though he had not eaten anything in quite some time. The victim was dressed in a blue, blood-stained shirt, which had what was described as a distinctive motif on the pocket, and he also wore stone-colored trousers with a 32-inch waist. It turned out the shirt was one of 2,000 in a consignment imported from Hong Kong in 1986 by Oatsport, a company based out of the London borough of Harrow, while the pants originated from a batch of 2,771 produced by the Falmer brand. It was determined that both these items were likely purchased from a Foster's clothing store, though investigators were unable to figure out the exact location. Since the spot where the torso was discovered was not particularly easy to find, police suspected that it had been dumped there by someone with knowledge of the area. It was located only 1 mile from where the A272 road intersected with the A23, a major road of transportation between London and Brighton. Since this area was undergoing heavy construction at the time, a public plea was sent out for workers to come forward if they recalled seeing or hearing anything unusual, but this didn't produce any promising leads. Curiously, some of the contemporary reporting about the torso stated that forensic tests had revealed that the victim was gay, though no specifics were provided about how they determined this. When asked for comment, the lead investigator, Detective Chief Inspector Peter Kennett, told the press, quote, "There was nothing to suggest that the dead man, whoever he was a homosexual, but nothing to suggest otherwise," end quote. The Sussex Police's investigation to figure out the victim's identity would be dubbed Operation A23 and proved to be so extensive that it involved over 60 people and cost around £150,000. The decedent was cross-checked with the files of over 100 missing men who matched his description, but he could not be identified and no one ever came forward to claim him. During the early stages of the investigation, it was reported that police were trying to track down a grey estate car which had been seen on Broxmead Lane the day before the body was found and had blankets covering the rear windows. They were also trying to find what they described as a fair-haired Scandinavian-looking man who appeared to be in his late 30s and was standing outside the estate car, but I'm not sure if he was ever identified. At one point, the tabloid newspaper The Sun speculated that the torso might be wanted fugitive Keith Cheeseman, who was involved in the notorious City Bonds robbery, a heist in which £291 million in bearer bonds were stolen from a courier in London on May 2, 1990. Cheeseman was in charge of laundering the stolen bonds and had skipped bail after he was arrested, but even though he bore a physical resemblance to the torso victim, Cheeseman was soon discovered to be alive and rearrested in Spain. Well, in December, investigators received a promising tip from a local real estate agent about a large house located on Copyhold Lane in Cuckfield, only about a mile and a half from the spot where the torso was found. According to the agent, a German man named Dr. Matthias Hermann, who claimed to be an AIDS expert, had rented the house and moved in there with his girlfriend in September. Dr. Hermann had made an advance payment of £10,000 worth of Deutschmarks, which was the equivalent of 6 months' rent, but both he and his girlfriend made the surprising decision to abandon the house only a few weeks later. In fact, the last date the couple were confirmed to have been there was October the 9th, only 2 days before the torso was found. When police performed a search of the house, they discovered that a lot of equipment had been left behind, including a number of telephones and fax machines, as well as a satellite television. But most intriguingly, they found a copy of Penthouse magazine, which just happened to contain an article titled Hitman's Holiday that featured a story about a murder victim who was dismembered to prevent identification. In fact, numbers were also scrawled on the article's pages, so the authorities wanted to track down Dr. Hermann for questioning. Well, it turned out that Dr. Matthias Hermann was just a pseudonym, as the renter's actual name was Gunther Josef Neiper. Neiper, who was 43 years old at the time, was a financial business consultant from Dresden, Germany, described as being a quote-unquote larger-than-life extrovert, but he was also wanted in both Germany and Ireland on suspicion of business fraud. Even though Neiper had a wife and 2 children, he was involved in a relationship with a woman named Cornelia Maria Tussel, who also happened to be the mysterious female companion who had moved into the house in Cuckfield with him. After leaving Germany, Neiper and Tussel had relocated to Cork, Ireland, in order to start a loan brokering business named Incotrade Private Limited alongside 3 other German men, Alfred Agar, Georg Heisler, and Matthias Richter. While there, the group rented a castle and a mansion, often threw lavish parties, and purchased a number of luxury cars and motorcycles. Their business would offer huge loans at competitive rates, charging a 1% commission which was payable in advance. However, rather than paying out the loans, the group would simply keep the commission payments and wound up making millions, and many of the people they conned were too embarrassed to report this fraud to the authorities. By April of 1991, the Frankfurt Police's fraud squad had caught on to the gang's activities and showed up in Ireland to assist the Garda with their investigation, but by that point, Neiper, Tussel, and their 3 associates had already fled the country. But it became apparent that their fraudulent actions had made them some enemies, as an envelope was found at Neiper's address containing a death threat, a 9mm bullet, and a photograph of his BMW. Shortly thereafter, Neiper and Tussel wound up renting the house in Cuckfield, and since a lot of high-tech equipment was found inside there, it seemed apparent that they were planning to launch another large-scale fraud operation before they suddenly took off for unknown reasons. Well, in January of 1992, one of Neiper's wanted associates, Alfred Agar, surrendered at the German embassy in Buenos Aires, Argentina, after claiming that his life had been threatened. 1 month later, another wanted associate, Georg Heisler, was also captured in Buenos Aires, and both he and Agar were extradited to Frankfurt. Well, in March of that year, Gunther Neiper was finally tracked down and arrested near Barcelona, Spain, but he soon suffered a heart attack which delayed his extradition. Unfortunately, I've been unable to find out if Cornelia Tussel or the 3rd wanted fraudster from the group, Matthias Richter, were ever tracked down and captured. In June, after Neiper was extradited to Frankfurt, the Sussex police traveled there in order to interview him about the Bolney Torso. Investigators wondered if the unidentified victim might have been an associate of Neiper's who was killed because he planned to blow the whistle on the fraud operation, but Neiper denied any knowledge or involvement in the murder. It would turn out that the numbers which had been scrawled on the pages of the Penthouse magazine article about dismemberment were in Neiper's handwriting, but Neiper insisted that he only purchased the magazine to look up contact information for escort girls, and because he was interested in another article they published about Land Rovers. In the end, no evidence could be found linking Neiper to the murder of the Bolney Torso victim, and I wasn't able to find out how much prison time he wound up serving on the fraud charges. In January of 1994, the Sussex police returned to Germany to interview another unnamed male who had apparently visited Neiper's property in Cuckfield around the time of the murder, but no additional details were provided. For nearly 3 years, The Bolney Torso was kept inside the freezer of the mortuary at the Princess Royal Hospital in Haywards Heath, but since he could not be identified, a decision was made to give him a pauper's funeral. On August the 2nd, a brief service was held for the victim, which was attended by 8 people, including representatives from the Sussex Police, the Coroner's Office, and the Mid-Sussex District Council, who paid for the funeral. The victim was placed inside a coffin which bore the name Unknown Male before he was laid to rest at Western Road Cemetery. In March of 2009, police decided to exhume the torso in order to perform some more advanced forensic testing, and a full DNA profile was extracted from him. In November of that year, this case would be featured on the popular BBC TV show Crime Watch, and the lead detectives at that time were also interviewed on a popular German TV crime show which profiled the story. The additional exposure did lead to some new tips, and investigators later revealed that they looked into at least 3 missing persons who looked like potential candidates to be the victim, but all of them were ruled out. In October of 2011, it was announced that based on the new forensic testing that was performed on the victim, the authorities were releasing a revised description of him. His height was now listed as being between 5'6" and 5'8", and even though he was initially thought to be between 45 to 60 years old, investigators now believe that he was most likely in his mid to late 30s at the time he was killed. Isotope analysis was performed on a femur bone and samples of a rib bone which belonged to the victim in hopes of determining where he originated from, and the results seemed to indicate that he may have hailed from the state of Bavaria in southeast Germany. This analysis was also performed on samples of the victim's toenails, which can often capture isotopes from the last year of a person's life, and these results showed that he may have spent his final year living in the United Kingdom or near the French-German border. A new analysis performed on the skeleton also showed that he was well-nourished and healthy at the time of his death and had a strongly built upper body with no signs of degenerative illness. New forensic testing was performed on the victim's clothing, and based on the results, investigators felt that the clothing did not belong to him and had been placed on his body prior to his death. I think they reached this conclusion because traces of DNA which did not match the victim were on the clothing, but there wasn't enough genetic material for them to create 2 separate DNA profiles. Investigators also revealed that they had recently re-interviewed a number of eyewitnesses in hopes of learning new information, which included making another trip to Germany, as they now wondered if the murder might have been linked to East German criminals who had traveled to the United Kingdom after the Berlin Wall came down in November of 1989. Well, in December of 2024, there would be a surprising development when Mick Randall, a retired detective from London's Metropolitan Police, gave an interview in which he publicly shared new information to suggest the Bolney Torso may have been connected to an unsolved double homicide which took place in London nearly 2 years beforehand. On the evening of December the 22nd, 1989, 39-year-old accountant Terry Gooderham went to visit his 32-year-old insurance investigator girlfriend Maxine Arnold at her flat on Shurnall Street in Walthamstow, located within the London borough of Waltham Forest. Terry and Maxine had planned a night out with friends, but when one of these friends phoned the flat at 6:45 p.m., Maxine apparently sounded rushed during the call and said she had to take Terry somewhere before she abruptly hung up. Shortly thereafter, Maxine's mother showed up at the flat and discovered that the couple were gone, even though there was an unfinished meal and the gas fire and Christmas tree lights were still on, and Terry's wallet and Maxine's purse had been left behind. Well, at around 3:50 a.m. on December the 23rd, a police patrol discovered Terry's Mercedes in a remote car park on Lodge Road in the Epping Forest District near the village of Upshire. Terry and Maxine were both dead in the front seat after having been shot in the back of their heads with a 12-gauge shotgun. The vehicle's engine was still running and the lights were still on, and Maxine had injuries on her hands to indicate that she likely tried to fight off the shooter before she was killed. Witnesses would later report having seen the Mercedes swerving erratically along Epping New Road between 7:15 and 7:45 p.m. the previous evening, and since the lights were flashing, it appeared that it was trying to attract attention. An unidentified man was also seen in the back seat, so the evidence strongly suggested that the couple had been abducted at gunpoint from Maxine's flat and forced to drive to Lodge Road in Terry's Mercedes before they were shot to death. 2 packets of cocaine were found inside the vehicle, but since the autopsy showed no traces of cocaine in either of the victim's systems and there were no drugs at Maxine's flat, it appeared that the killer had planted the cocaine to make it look like the crime was drug-related. Well, Terry and Maxine did not have criminal records, but since Terry was an accountant and auditor for a number of London pubs, one of the most prominent theories is that he was killed because he was planning to inform on a pub protection racket he had uncovered. This scheme would allegedly involve criminal figures hijacking trucks containing shipments of alcohol and only delivering them to pub owners if they paid a fee. When a cold case review was performed in 2012, they concluded that 4 members of a London crime gang were suspected of being involved in the murders, but no arrests were ever made and the case was never solved. However, when Mick Randall delivered his aforementioned interview at the end of 2024, he revealed that a criminal informant had once told him that the contract for Terry and Maxine's murders was put up by a notorious gangster named Connie Whitehead. Even though Randall said he passed this information along to the London murder squad who were working the case, nothing was ever done with it, since there was apparently widespread corruption within the Metropolitan Police at that time. But Randall also revealed that when the crime was being investigated during the 1990s, a bug was placed at a porta-cabin owned by one of the gangsters suspected of being involved as he ran a business in Canning Town. According to Randall, the bug recorded a conversation between this gangster and some of his associates where they discussed cutting off the head and arms of another victim. While this victim was never named, the gangster said that this body was kept in a car trunk and his limbs were removed to make him harder to identify since he had some distinctive tattoos. Well, given that this conversation took place during the same time period, Randall suspected that they may have been referring to the Bolney Torso. When former lead investigator Peter Kennett was asked about this alleged recording, he claimed that this was the first time he ever heard of it, and its current whereabouts are unknown. But Kennett did confirm that the Sussex police always suspected that the Bolney victim's death may have been a gangland killing connected to London, but they never got any assistance from the Metropolitan Police. Whatever the case, over 33 years have now passed since the discovery of the Bolney Torso, but his identity and the circumstances of his murder continue to remain unsolved mysteries. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So obviously, before I start discussing this case, the first topic I need to get out of the way is the possibility of using investigative genetic genealogy to identify this victim. As I'm sure you know, genetic genealogy has led to the resolution of a number of cold cases in North America these past several years, as well as the identification of hundreds of John and Jane Does. However, due to a number of ethical, legal, and safeguarding considerations, investigative genetic genealogy has yet to be fully embraced by the United Kingdom, so even though law enforcement has a DNA profile for the Bolney Torso, I do not believe it has ever been entered into any genealogical databases. While it sounds like DNA testing has been used to rule out a couple of missing persons as being the victim, another complication is that he may have hailed from an entirely different country than the United Kingdom, which could cause all sorts of red tape. So for the moment, it seems the best approach is finding someone who seems like a promising candidate to be the Bolney victim, tracking down any surviving family members they have to collect a sample of their DNA, and performing testing to see whether or not they are a genetic match. In most cases involving unidentified John and Jane Does, the authorities are able to produce a composite sketch to show what the victim might have looked like, but obviously, since the Bolney Torso's head was never found, that's not an option in this particular case. Of course, many of these cases involving murdered decedents are usually two mysteries rolled into one, because even if they determine the victim's identity, you still have to figure out who is responsible for killing them. And since the killer in this particular case went to the trouble of removing the victim's head and hands in order to prevent identification via dental records or fingerprints, you get the impression they knew what they were doing, and this may not have been their first homicide. There's also the fact that a larger section of the victim's right arm was removed than his left arm, which has led to speculation that he had a distinctive tattoo there, which would have greatly increased the chances of identification if it was publicized. One of the primary theories is that this was a gangland killing, and since dismembering a victim to prevent identification is a common tactic used by those involved in organized crime, this theory doesn't seem implausible. So for the longest time, the biggest lead in this case involved Gunther Neiper and his fraud operation, and even though it seemed like an awfully convenient coincidence that he happened to rent a house in the area during the approximate time period the murder took place, and then took off only a few days before the torso was found, this angle ultimately didn't lead anywhere. But at the end of 2024, we had the allegations from retired police detective Mick Randall that the same group of gangsters who were responsible for the unsolved murders of Terry Gooderham and Maxine Arnold may have also killed the Bolney victim. I will add the disclaimer that this new information from Randall was only reported by the Daily Mail and the Daily Mirror, a pair of British tabloids which are notorious for publishing false or heavily sensationalized stories, and since I haven't seen Randall's claims corroborated by law enforcement or more legitimate media outlets, you should probably take them with a grain of salt. Randall alleges that a bugged recording was once made of gangsters discussing the dismemberment of a body in a fashion that was remarkably similar to the Bolney Torso. Peter Kennett, the original lead investigator on the Bolney case, confirmed that he never heard of the existence of this alleged recording, but Randall says there was so much corruption within the Metropolitan Police during the early 1990s that the recording may have been lost or destroyed a long time ago. Unfortunately, we don't have an exact time frame for when this conversation supposedly took place, but what we do know is that the Gooderham-Arnold murders and the Bolney Torso murder took place nearly 2 years apart. So even if the same group of individuals was responsible for both crimes, that doesn't necessarily mean they are connected. But before we talk any more about the Torso, we should discuss the murders of Terry Gooderham and Maxine Arnold, as this is a pretty interesting cold case in its own right. The couple was in the midst of having dinner together at Maxine's flat before something caused them to abruptly leave, and they were found shot to death inside Terry's Mercedes in the car park in the Epping Forest District several hours later. Even though this was known as a lover's lane area for couples, it's extremely unlikely that Terry and Maxine just decided to make out before they were shot to death, as they left behind Terry's wallet, Maxine's purse, and some unfinished meals, and as far as anyone could tell, they had never been to that area before. We know that one of Maxine's friends phoned her flat that evening, and she mentioned having to take Terry somewhere, but while there was initial speculation that the couple may have been lured to the car park and left of their own accord, I think it's more likely that they were abducted from the flat and that their killer was there when Maxine's friend called. They were then forced to drive to the murder scene in Terry's Mercedes, as we have eyewitness accounts of the vehicle driving erratically and flashing its lights, and a man was seen in the back seat who was probably holding them at gunpoint. After this person shot the couple, he then left some packets of cocaine in the car in a half-assed attempt to make the murders look drug-related. I'm also sure that multiple people were involved in the crime, since the killer would have needed another person to drive them away from the murder scene. During the early stages of the investigation, it was discovered that Terry was carrying on a secret affair with another woman, but she was ruled out as a suspect, and the police eventually came to believe that the motive may have been related to Terry's job and that he uncovered something which put his life in danger. The specific theory pushed forward by Mick Randall is that since Terry worked as an accountant and auditor for a number of pubs, he may have found out about a pub protection racket involving organized crime figures, and that a notorious gangster named Connie Whitehead may have put the contract out on him. Back during the 1960s, Whitehead worked for twin brothers Ronald and Reginald Cray, who ran a criminal gang known as the Firm and are considered to be two of the most infamous gangsters in the history of London. The Crays were arrested in 1968 and still incarcerated by the time Terry and Maxine were murdered, but even though Whitehead served 7 years in prison for his association with the Firm, he was a free man by 1989. In fact, Whitehead lived to the age of 86 and did not pass away until December of 2023, which could explain why all these allegations about him being the mastermind behind the Gooderham-Arnold murders did not come out until last year. While Whitehead allegedly put up the contract, it's been suspected that at least 4 people were complicit in this crime, but none of them were brought to justice. Now, I don't have any strong opinions about whether or not these allegations against Whitehead are correct, and it's also never been specified if Whitehead was one of the gangsters on the recording during the conversation about the dismemberment of another body. These gangsters supposedly mentioned cutting off the head and arms of another victim who had distinctive tattoos in order to prevent identification, but even if this conversation took place, we can't be certain they were referring to the Bolney Torso. After all, he's likely not the only murder victim who had his head and arms removed by organized crime figures. And not to sound pedantic, but the Bolney victim technically had both of his hands and part of his right forearm removed rather than his entire arms. Even though this exchange took place in London, Bolney is located only about 36 miles away, and the location where the torso was found was only about a mile away from the A23. So if the victim was killed in London, I could see the responsible party using the A23 to transport his body out of the city and then pulling off into a remote area if they wanted to dump it somewhere. It's been suspected that even though the torso was there for about a day or two before it was found, the victim may have been dead for as long as a week, so perhaps he was kept on ice for a while in London while the perpetrators figured out what to do. Now, the issue with this scenario is that the torso was found in the woods behind a gate next to an overgrown bridle path, and it sounds like this spot would have been difficult to find unless you were familiar with the area. It's actually just blind luck that Colin Oliver happened to stumble across the torso when he did, because if more time had passed, it may have decomposed so much that the remains would have been scattered by animals and never found. And not to make light of the situation, but it is amusing to think how many of these dead bodies wind up being found because someone needed to find a remote spot to take a piss. When isotope analysis was performed on the victim, it was estimated that he hailed from the state of Bavaria in Germany, but may have lived the last year of his life in the United Kingdom, so this wouldn't preclude the idea of him being killed in London. If you're not familiar with the whole process of isotope analysis, I discussed it many years ago in episode number 129 about the murder of Little Miss Panisofsky, an unidentified murder victim whose body was found in Lake Panisofsky in Florida in February of 1971. In that case, lead isotopes from the victim's teeth were analyzed, and they apparently contained such a distinctive lead signal that a geochemist was able to trace it to a specific fishing port town in Greece. As a result, he felt there was a good chance that the victim had once lived there, which would help explain why no one was able to identify her when she turned up dead in Florida. I definitely do not believe that this particular victim lived in Bolney or the surrounding area, because if he had just suddenly turned up missing around that time period, I think someone would have been able to find out who he was. And while isotope analysis cannot be considered to be 100% accurate, I would not be surprised in the least if this man hailed from another country, because all attempts to cross-check him with missing persons reports from the United Kingdom have gone nowhere. But if he had friends and family in, say, Germany, who were wondering what happened to him, they may not have had any idea that he was found dead near a village in England. For years, it was reported that the victim was believed to be between the ages of 45 and 60, but following his exhumation in 2009, new forensic testing prompted investigators to change their mind, as they now believe he was more likely to have been in his mid to late 30s. So you have to wonder if having an incorrect age range out there for so long may have possibly hampered identification. It's also interesting how this new forensic testing caused investigators to believe that the clothing the victim was found wearing likely did not belong to him, and he was dressed in it by someone else following his death. Details are vague, but it sounds like this conclusion may have been reached based on the presence of DNA on the clothing which did not belong to the victim, though there wasn't enough to create a separate DNA profile. I can understand the killer disposing of the victim's clothing if they felt it would help prevent identification, but I do find it odd that they would even go to the trouble of dressing him in different clothing rather than just dumping his nude body into the woods. After all, investigators were able to match the shirt and pants to specific consignments sold in England, and while they were unable to trace who actually purchased this clothing, it's still an unnecessary risk. The victim's body was found wrapped in a piece of carpet, but as far as I can tell, this detail was not released to the public until years after the fact. On the 20-year anniversary of the discovery of the torso, an interview was conducted with Colin Oliver, the man who found it, and he wondered if there was DNA on the carpet belonging to the person who carried it there. That is a very valid question, but investigators have never confirmed or denied this, and if they do have DNA belonging to an outside party, it may not be enough for a full profile. Other interesting details which have been released about the victim were that he was circumcised, which could mean he was Jewish. I'm also curious about the fact that some of the earliest media coverage pushed forward the idea that the victim was gay, and while lead investigator Peter Kennett cannot confirm that, he also said that he cannot confirm it wasn't true either. The press has not mentioned this angle in many years, so I'm not entirely sure why they speculated that this man was gay. It's never been reported that there were any signs of sexual assault, but I do wonder if there was physical evidence to suggest he may have experienced consensual anal sex prior to his death. If there's one heartwarming aspect to tragic stories like this involving murdered decedents, it's when the community where the victim was found decides to give them a funeral service and a burial, which is what happened here. Even though the people who buried this man may have been complete strangers, it does give off the message that someone cares about him. Now, it's been reported by some sources that in December of 1995, just a few days before Christmas, some flowers were left at the victim's grave, accompanied by a note which read, quote, "For the unknown male, Peter and team, remember our loss," end quote. When I first read about that detail, I figured that Peter was Peter Kennett, as it makes sense that the case's lead investigator would leave a note on the grave of a murder victim on behalf of his team. An article published by the Brighton-based newspaper The Argus in August of 2004 makes it sound like this note was some big mystery and that the author was never identified, but since this detail doesn't get mentioned by most other sources, I have a feeling some wires may have been crossed during the publication of this article and that Peter Kennett was the one who wrote it. Another detail which got mentioned during the early press coverage was the sighting of a gray estate car which had been seen on Broxmead Lane the day before the torso was found and had blankets covering the rear windows, and what appeared to be a fair-haired Scandinavian-looking man in his late 30s standing outside. It's certainly reasonable to assume that the driver of this car may have been dumping the torso in the woods, but since this detail hasn't been mentioned by the press in a long time, I have to wonder if investigators were able to identify this man and clear him of any involvement. But it wasn't long after the detail was reported when a very promising German suspect named Gunther Neiper popped up on the radar. Neiper was 43 at the time, and I'm not sure if he drove a grey estate car during his time in West Sussex. I've never seen any photographs of Neiper, but amusingly enough, when the authorities were trying to track him down, the media report stated that he looked like the character of Harold Bishop, who was portrayed by actor Ian Smith on the popular, long-running Australian soap opera Neighbours. And well, if you check out photographs of Harold Bishop / Ian Smith, he does not look like a fair-haired 30-something Scandinavian man. So to recap, in September of 1991, Neiper and his girlfriend, Cornelia Tussel, rented out a house in the village of Cuckfield, only about a mile and a half from the spot where the torso was found. They paid 6 months' rent in advance and were clearly planning to start another fraud operation, but then they abruptly abandoned the house and fled the country, leaving a bunch of equipment behind, and the last date they were seen there was October the 9th, 2 days before the torso's discovery. And of course, there was the discovery of a copy of Penthouse magazine in the house, which contained an article about the dismemberment of a murder victim with some numbers on the pages in Neiper's handwriting. That certainly seems like a few too many suspicious coincidences, and when you remember that the victim may have also been German, it's easy to assume that he was connected to Neiper and murdered by him, perhaps because he knew too much about his fraud operation. Yes, it might seem odd that Neiper would dispose of the torso only a mile and a half from where he was staying, but if he was planning to flee the country anyway, it may not have mattered. But to be fair, Neiper was already a wanted fugitive at this point for a number of fraud schemes, and he had also made a lot of enemies for his fraudulent loan operation in Ireland, so much so that he wound up receiving a death threat. So it's possible that Neiper and Tussel abruptly left their rented house in Cuckfield because they felt the authorities were onto them, or they feared that someone was trying to kill them, and a torso being dumped into a nearby wooded area had nothing to do with them. I know that Neiper and 2 of his associates in his fraud operation, Alfred Agar and Jörg Heisler, were eventually captured and extradited back to Germany, but I'm not sure how much prison time they received, and I have no idea of their current whereabouts or if they're even still alive. I also don't know if any charges were ever filed against Cornelia Tussel or anything about her current whereabouts either. However, I am most intrigued by Kniper's third associate, Matthias Richter, as I cannot find any confirmation about whether or not he was eventually captured. But most importantly, was any evidence ever uncovered to prove that Richter was still alive after October the 11th, 1991? I may be grasping at straws, as police may have already explored this angle and ruled it out, but could Richter have been the Bolney Torso? Well, Kniper always denied any involvement in what happened to the Bolney victim, and even though he was definitely a major fraudster, I haven't heard anything about him having a history of violence to show that he would have been capable of committing murder and dismembering a body. But if Richter joined Kniper in Cuckfield, and Kniper feared that he was going to blow the whistle on his operation or something, he could have killed Richter and gone to the trouble of removing his head and hands to prevent identification. We know that Agar and Heisler fled to Buenos Aires, Argentina, but I find it interesting that Agar decided to willingly turn himself in at the German embassy in January of 1992 because he said his life was being threatened. No further details were provided, but perhaps he feared that Kniper might come after him as well because he knew too much. Once again, it's possible that investigators have already explored this angle and ruled out the possibility that Richter is the Bolney Torso, but if Kniper was responsible for killing this person, it makes you wonder who else he would have murdered and what the motive was. After all, Kniper had only been in the area for a few weeks before the victim was found. Could some angry investor from Ireland track Kniper there and then wound up being killed because he threatened his life? Well, whatever the case, investigators were unable to turn up any evidence linking Kniper to the crime, though I don't believe they officially ruled him out as a suspect. But I do have to acknowledge that the manner in which the victim was murdered and dismembered does more closely resemble the hallmarks of a gangland killing rather than a crime from a con artist. While Mick Randall has always alleged that corruption within the Metropolitan Police prevented the murders of Terry Gooderham and Maxine Arnold from being solved, the murder of the Bolney victim was investigated by the Sussex Police, and it sounds like they went all out in trying to identify this man. I don't get the sense that there was corruption or a cover-up in this particular investigation, but if the murder was connected to organized crime from London, then I suppose it's possible that the Metropolitan Police could have hampered things by not sharing key information with the Sussex Police. If there is a connection between the Bolney Torso and London, then perhaps this new information shared by Randall about the Gooderham-Arnold case might pave the way towards some new leads. Like I mentioned earlier, investigative genetic genealogy has not yet been fully embraced in the United Kingdom, so they still don't have the option of entering this man's DNA into a genealogy database and hoping they get a genetic match. For the moment at least, they have to use other means to identify this person and solve his murder, and it might take the right person who knows something to come forward. So if you happen to have any information about the identity of the Bolney Torso or the circumstances behind his murder, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.werder@icloud.com. That's robin.werder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 7 years, our Patreon page has released over 80 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about the Lancaster extortion writer, a strange case which was featured on Unsolved Mysteries and involved over 250 residents of the city of Lancaster, California, receiving a series of threatening letters in 1988, which demanded that they pay out large amounts of money or they would be killed. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path That Went Chili, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discussed the 2001 murder of David Buller, a professor from the University of Toronto who was killed inside his own office. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 70 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Susie G, Orion G, Jake, and Kate. Thank you all so much for your support. I also wanted to mention that The Trail Went Cold will be appearing on Podcast Row at the True Crime Podcast Festival, which is taking place in Boston, Massachusetts at the Doubletree by Hilton Hotel, Boston North Shore, from July the 18th to the 20th. If you would like to purchase tickets, we have a specialized promo code you can use to get a 20% discount on them. So please visit truecrimepodcastfestival.com and use the promo code ROBIN20 to get 20% off tickets. Once again, visit truecrimepodcastfestival.com and the promo code is ROBIN20. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.